I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan, and this is Beauty at Work, the podcast that seeks to expand our understanding of beauty, what it is, how it works, and why it matters for the work we do. This season of the podcast is sponsored by Templeton Religion Trust and is focused on the beauty and burdens of innovation. Hey everybody, this is part 2 of my conversation with Scott D. Anthony about his new book, Epic Disruptions. In the first half, we traced how disruptive innovations emerge, and let's now turn to the leader's playbook, how to spot real disruption, how to invest across time horizons and overcome the ghosts that hold organizations back, and what disruptive innovation might mean for religious organizations. Let's get started. One of the other sort of misperceptions I think your book dispels is the idea that disruptive changes sort of creep on us unexpectedly, right? And so I think you're arguing. I think you say that you've never met a market leader that didn't see the disruption coming. And as you mentioned, the case of the Catholic Church, they even funded the disruption. So there is a dilemma, certainly, it seems, for leaders. Do they recognize and invest in a disruption, which would be good in the long term, but that would come with the short term pain that they have to endure, right? And so how should they navigate that? What should leaders do in this case? How do they recognize a disruption, and to what extent should they invest in it?
So first, on the recognition point, there is a very clear pattern of disruption. There are three big elements to it. One, you have something that is introducing purposeful trade-offs. So taking complicated and expensive things, making them simple and affordable. So you have a purposeful trade-off. Second, a disruption will typically start not in the middle of the mainstream of the market, but at a fringe or at an edge somewhere. And third, what will really drive the disruptive growth is a powerful business model where you can create, deliver, and capture value in new ways. So if you fast forward to today, where do we see this happening? You look at professional services, you see very clear signs where people say, we have artificial intelligence that enables us to offer very different forms of services. We can start not in the mainstream, but among people who aren't using people like McKinsey or Deloitte or big tax providers or so on. And we're going to make money in very different ways. It's just ding, 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 big warning sign that it's coming. So that's the first thing. The second thing is recognizing, again, this is not an either or thing. A good executive will say, yes, I've got a great business that I want to maximize, that I want to strengthen, that I want to make more resilient. And I will recognize that is ultimately a frail, dying business. So I will also go and invest in what will be the next generation for my business. And the key thing in getting this right is to play in your mind with timeframes. If you look at what I should do over the next minute, it's very clear. You invest every marginal thing that you have in today better. If you look over the next 100 years, it's also very clear. You invest everything in tomorrow. The trick is to say, how do I span both of those timeframes simultaneously? Not easy to do, but if you play with time, you can see it's very obvious to have a good balanced portfolio that both sustains today and disrupts and creates tomorrow.
Yeah. Do you have any good examples of companies that have done that, case studies that you've seen where they've successfully been able to do this?
Oh, Brandon, I'm smiling because I was debating giving the case study. I thought my answer had gotten too long-winded. So I'm glad you've asked the follow-on question so I can do it. It's a case that I teach my students in my class, Leading Disruptive Change. I think it's a really fun one. In 2014, Masahiko Uotani became the CEO of Shiseido, which is a Japanese cosmetics company. He was the first outsider to helm the company in its then 142 years of history. The company had been stagnant, declining for a couple decades, and he launched a very bold transformation strategy that had basically changes to everything, the product portfolio, how it was organized, even the spoken language going from Japanese to English. And it worked, delivered huge growth, transformed the company, et cetera. One key to it is he had essentially a 240 plus year strategy. So he would go forward 100 years and say, what we are doing is we are laying the foundation for Shiseido's future. And he would go back 142 years and say, while it feels like everything is changing, we have always been a place where East meets West. We have always been a place where science meets beauty. We are changing to remain unchanged. So you give people something to hold on to in the midst of all the change, give them an inspirational destination to get to, and make sure, again, you're getting that balance of today and tomorrow right. I interviewed their former CFO, and he said, with a 100-year time frame, there were some decisions that would have been hard that became really easy. So should we invest in a new R&D facility? Of course. We needed the new R&D facility for the next 100 years. We had to still deliver the quarter. That's not a choice. That's not an option. But that means we have to do great things in the short term so we can enable everything we want to do in the long term. That view of time, changing that view of time really changed the way people thought about it. Now, if you're a student in an upcoming run of Leading Disruptive Change, cover your ears. What I do in class, which I think it's super fun, I have a cold call for this class, but the class doesn't see it coming. I find someone in the class, and there's always someone who majored in philosophy. And I say, tell me about time. And they kind of do a triple take. And they're like, what?
Uh-huh.
I said, just tell me about time. And the first time I did it, the student said, I'm sorry, you're not going to like my answer. Time isn't real. I'm like, no, no, no. I love your answer. Let's keep going.
Okay, okay. I mean, this is really resonant with some other research I've done with some colleagues in Italy around looking for models of what we call social generativity. So these are we're trying to find companies and organizations that that sort of are paving a way out of consumer society. And what we find a lot of these cases are very much this sort of what we call intertemporality. So there's a deep connection to the past, a sense of rootedness in the past, and also a very, very long-term horizon, 200, 500 years. So Brunello Cucinelli is another firm that comes to mind from the fashion industry, where the firm is again really looking to ancient philosophy and the work practices of Benedictine monks and so on, and also trying to build 200 years into the future a sort of revitalized community where artisans continue to thrive and flourish, right? And so, very hard to get that kind of perspective in the face of immense market pressure, and especially if you're a publicly traded company.
I just on that, I don't know. People will say that. I don't know that I really believe it. Is what the thing I draw on when people say that is there's a field called adaptive leadership. Ron Heifetz at the Harvard Kennedy School is kind of the main thought leader behind it, and they have this chart that just really every time I see it, it speaks to me. It talks about the relationship between change and discomfort, and what it says is as you're going through change, discomfort is induced. At some point, you cross a threshold. It's good. You have to be uncomfortable to change. You're working out. You tear muscle to rebuild it. At some point, you cross a threshold. It's bad. You can't tolerate it. When that's a physical threshold, your body tells you, you stop, you recognize it. When it's an emotional threshold, you get signals, but you don't really recognize them. So you want to find ways to make it go away. So you find ways in sophisticated ways to avoid that, to avoid the work. And you create defense mechanisms. You scapegoat, you find other people to blame. And when I hear people say, well, I wish I could, but the public shareholders won't let me. To me, it feels like work avoidance. It feels like trying to find a reason to avoid doing something that, yes, is very uncomfortable and is hard, but is doable. Jeff Bezos convinced investors that you could be misunderstood for long periods of time. Mark Bertolini, when he was the CEO of Aetna, said basically, I'm going to follow this 20-year plan. If you don't like it, there are plenty of other stocks that you can invest in and then delivered against what he said he was going to do. Michael Mauboussin has done research that shows you can do this. You can change your shareholders if you change the way that you message to them. So those leaders that say they're constrained by shareholders, I think they're constrained by their own limitations, to be honest.
Right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, so what does it really take then to? I mean, does it just require a leader to really commit to that long-term horizon in the face of whatever seeming pressures or potential objections? Does it require? Is it an individual characteristic? Is it some sort of virtue, or are there other factors that you think would help companies to actually really invest in this long-term vision?
So good news, bad news, there's a lot. So it's not just
Okay.
individual virtue, which is good because if it's just you have to be touched by whatever in the right way, then there's a few precious people who can do it. And of course, leadership is critical in all of this. There are heroes and stories. There also are systems and structures and things you need to put in place to do it. I call these all technical tools, very well documented about how you put in portfolio management and all that. The hard part of the problem, in my mind, is the adaptive part of the problem. Because when you are going through something like this, there's no clear right answer. There's a possibility that people are going to lose. You're going to have one division win, one division lose, et cetera. And there's a certainty that you're going to struggle. It's going to be painful. So to me, by far, the most important thing is dealing with those adaptive challenges. And that requires that a team is willing to be patient. A team takes a long-term perspective. A team can be calm in the midst of chaos. A team can use multi-cognition to be able to see lots of different perspectives. You can have a paradox mindset so they see possibilities and tensions. It is a higher order set of skills. Good news, all skills that can be developed if people consciously practice them. The thing I would say the biggest barrier to all of this, I'd say this in the back half of chapter 10 of the book, the chapter on steel. Every organization is haunted by ghosts. Those ghosts are invisible and incredibly powerful. And if you don't see them, spot them, and exercise them, EXORCISE, not exercise
Yes.
them,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then you will never succeed. And it's really hard. I mean, this is something that I think most organizations struggle a lot with.
Yeah, could you say a bit more about that? Because I mean, even just that sense of identity is so critical for a lot of organizations, right? And it's not just businesses, right? So any kind of organization that needs to innovate is tied to the ghosts of the past. Could you say a little bit about what it takes to overcome that, and how do they recognize these things, and how should they develop the capacities to move forward? And you could use that example there, yeah.
Yeah, I think step one is recognizing them. So, the Bethlehem Steel chapter, what I did with that chapter is if you've ever studied Clay Christensen, his favorite story is talking about steel mini mills. And he'll talk about how Nucor Steel came up with this electric arc furnace that allowed it to melt scrap steel and sell it for lower prices, and went and disrupted integrated steel producers like Bethlehem Steel. So I said, okay, let me tell that story with some more details around it. I do it, and one of my early reviewers says, it's pretty boring. Can you flip it? Can you look at it through the eyes of the person who's getting disrupted? I said, that's interesting. I hadn't done that. So I went and researched the history of Bethlehem Steel. And I had just written an article recently about the idea of ghosts. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is just now clear in plain sight. So the ghosts of the past, those are traumas an organization has never gotten over. Bethlehem Steel, like everybody in the steel industry, had labor dispute after labor dispute after labor dispute. Steel mini mills relied primarily on non-unionized labor. So if Bethlehem Steel was going to respond in kind, it had to go play the we're going to go and break the union card. No way. It was too traumatic to do that. Every organization has ghosts of the present, invisible patterns that they're following without being aware of them. Bethlehem Steel had an amazing 70-year history. Andrew Carnegie going to Charles Schwab, going to Eugene Grace, 70 years of leaders who focused on making sure the mills were run full, who focused not on pioneering, but on optimization, who focused on scale. That was their DNA. That's just what they did. And then the ghost that you mentioned that I think is the most important one, the ghost of the future, where the prospect of change raises a fear that your essence as an organization or as an individual is going to be invalidated. So Bethlehem Steel, a rational, logical thing to do would be to shut down the plant in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and say, it doesn't make sense for us to still do this. Let's go to other geographies and do things that are more economical. Bethlehem Steel, that's the company's name. That's what the company is. That's who the people at the company are. You go and talk to people who are working today in automobile companies, and you say, what do you do? I'm a car person. I work for a car company. You get deeper, they're mechanical engineers. That's who they are as people. They're not electrical engineers. They're not software engineers. They're not software designers. That's not the essence of who they are. So these ghosts of the future are really powerful and really hard to address. Going back to the case study about Shiseido, one of the things that I thought Uotani-san did so well is saying, let's give people something to hold on to. Let's say, yes, a lot of things are going to change, but let's be clear about what isn't going to change. History can be an anchor. It can hold you back. It can also be a catalyst if you use it in the right sort of way. And I thought he and his team were very smart about using it, so the ghosts of the future didn't hold them back.
Right. Yeah, that's great. One of the concepts you use in the book is this idea of competing against non-consumption, and Clay talks about that as a key path for disruptive success. Could you say a bit about what that phrase means and why that's important?
Well, the basic idea is you have essentially two choices if you're launching something. One is to compete in established market against what people are already buying. The other is to find somebody who cannot consume because that which exists is too expensive, requires specialized skills, requires training, and so on. The pattern of disruptive innovation is often finding ways to compete against non-consumption, because in those markets, something is better than nothing at all. A modern example of this. So when I break out ChatGPT and think about using it to help my kids with a problem or design something for my students, the choice is it better than the excellent teachers that they have in their classes? Is it better than the education I'm providing in the classes? And there are pros and cons. And you can say, done in the right way, it can be better, but that's the trade off. If you are living in a country that does not have an education infrastructure, that does not have MBA programs, ChatGPT is a lot better than nothing at all. And this is where you're seeing some tremendous growth in ChatGPT and other large language models, because you now have the ability to have a teacher in your pocket, to have a doctor in your pocket, because before you had nothing, now you have something. And when that's the choice, you will tolerate something that has all sorts of limitations, because again, something is better than nothing. So would-be innovators, if you can find something like this, where you see a market that is constrained because you need specialized skills, wealth, et cetera, to consume something, that can be a great opportunity to drive disruptive growth.
Yeah, that's great. Another point that you make is the idea of business models not as fixed things, but as systems. You talked about creating value, delivering value, capturing value. Could you say a bit more about that systemic dimension of innovation? And I think the McDonald's case is one where you really illustrate that.
And one of the proud parenting moments, I had a book launch event at the local bookstore in Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts, and my family was kind enough to join. And I cold called my 9-year-old at one point. Someone asked a question about McDonald's from the audience. And I asked my 9-year-old Teddy, I said, what's special about McDonald's? And like that, he said the speedy service system, which was very good, which was one of the elements. So, one of the questions is, why McDonald's? McDonald's was not the first burger chain. It was not the first franchise restaurant, but it really was the first to break through and deliver fast food at scale. Well, it really was the system. So it started with the speedy service system that was created in 1948 by Dick and Mac McDonald. They were running a restaurant that sold many things, and they were frustrated. So they said, let's radically simplify the menu, 9 items. Let's borrow Henry Ford's assembly line and bring it to food and make it very simple, very reliable, very affordable, so we can create value for our customers in new ways. Ray Kroc comes in 1954 and says, this is amazing. I want to essentially be your master franchisor and bring this to more places. He then found a unique way to deliver that value. Most people would set up franchise systems in a very extractive way. You try and strike a deal with a local franchise owner where you get as much from them as possible. Kroc and his team embraced mutuality. Let's create a win-win relationship where we can all grow together. Everything's working great over the next few years, except for one problem. The McDonald's Corporation, which oversees all of this, isn't making any money. They made $159,000 the first 6 years of existence. Enter Henry Sonnenborn, who became CEO of McDonald's. He didn't really care about hamburgers. He cared a lot about making money. So he came up with the real estate model. He said, let's find great pieces of land. Let's lease it. Let's then sublease it to our franchise owners. Let's still follow mutuality, so make sure that we only win when they win, but let's lock in a nice margin on that land. You put all those pieces together, the speedy service system and a great way to create value, mutuality to deliver that value, the real estate model to capture that value, you create a flywheel that gets bigger and goes faster as you keep growing. Burger Chef, which became Burger King, or other chains, they might make a burger that's as good. They might have a good relationship with a particular franchise owner, but it's really hard to get all of that going together because there are links between it. It reinforces. Things are easy to copy. Systems are really hard to copy. And that's what McDonald's teaches us.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, and there's also just that the recognition in a lot of your cases of where a number of these successful innovations are not just a single innovation, but a recombination of multiple innovations, right? That you have to have a number of things in place. So let's talk about the iPhone. I was surprised to learn that Clay Christensen thought that the iPhone would fail. So say a little bit more about why he thought so, and then what that mistake of his can teach us about how disruptive innovation works.
It's a pretty famous example. So I was not surprised by it because I knew it coming in. But yeah, so the basic idea, in the middle of 2007, right as the iPhone is getting ready to launch, he talks to someone from Business Week and he says, through my model, The iPhone looks like a late entrant in an established category of mobile phones. And my model predicts if you are introducing what he calls a sustaining innovation, which offers better performance along traditional dimensions in an established market, you will fail. So I therefore predict that Apple will fail. He actually would never use I, he would always say the model. He was very dogmatic about it. The model predicts that this will fail. And of course, the Apple iPhone did anything but fail. It was probably the most successful product in history. What Clay later admitted he got wrong was that frame. He said, well, I was looking at the Apple iPhone compared to other phones, and what the Apple iPhone really was the fourth generation of computers. So you had mainframes, you had microcomputers, you had personal computers, and you had pocket computers. And the Apple iPhone was arguably the pioneer of the pocket computing market. Now, interestingly, Steve Jobs didn't see this. When Apple launched the iPhone, Steve Jobs was asked, what is the killer app for the iPhone? They said, well, it's a phone. So the killer app is making and receiving phone calls. And in the early days, the iPhone sales were not that great. Of course, you had people who lined up on day one to get the Jesus phone, but that was a very small group of people. The problem was there were not many apps on the iPhone. It was a closed system. There were only 16 apps on it, no app store. And Jobs didn't want one. He wanted to have control. Ultimately, his team convinced him that he needed to open it up. Then you really have the full power of the computer in your pocket. Sales take off. Disruption is in full bloom. So this teaches us a few things. Number one, even super smart people like Clay Christensen and Steve Jobs don't get it right 100% of the time. Number two, you have to watch the movie, not the snapshot. The snapshot said in the middle of 2007, hey, there's reasons to doubt. The movie says, hey, if we see this, that suggests the odds of success have gone up. And opening up that app store, that was the big moment.
Yeah, that's great. Let's talk a little bit about the flip side of innovation. I mean, you notice, your fourth question is around how innovation is not always a positive, unmitigated good. It often casts a shadow. So how do we make sense of the burdens of innovation, and how should innovators and society reckon with these burdens?
Oh, it's a huge question, and a really important one that is just too frequently overlooked. You can think of three categories of things. So first, when you do have something introduced that truly is disruptive, it will change dynamics in a marketplace. That means there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers. If we look at one of the ones I name in the conclusion of the book, autonomous vehicles, I was just talking to somebody yesterday who works for a big trucking company, and they're pushing really hard to drive autonomy, no pun intended. And it makes sense because a big cost driver for long haul routes is the driver in the car. Now, the challenge is that's also the number one source of employment in many states in the United States. When it goes away, not if, when it goes away, what are we going to do? That's one shadow of disruption. The second shadow of disruption is what happens in marketplaces. If we stick with automobiles for a minute, back in the 1920s, I talk about this in the Model T chapter, there's chaos in the streets of major cities because they were built not for cars, but for people and pedestrians. It required technology, it required norms, it required regulation to get through that. You bring this to modern times, and I really worry that we are blowing it when it comes to artificial intelligence, saying, hey, we don't need to worry about anything. Let technology work itself out. History says that is not a very good approach. Then the final shadow is for the individual. As humans, we all suffer from what's known as the status quo bias. All things being equal, we would like things to remain exactly the same. When disruption drives changes, that's scary. I remember the first time I got into a Waymo, into a robo-taxi. I do this for a living. I teach, I preach, I talk about it, and still my palms got sweaty. I was nervous because I'm a human being, and new stuff can be kind of scary. You add on top of that, if we're in a company and our identity is being threatened, this is really important stuff. So I think the very first thing is recognize these three categories of shadows exist. And don't expect they're just going to work themselves out without a lot of pain, is they won't. So we need to have people being thoughtful about it. We need to have government and regulators helping out with it. The alternative is very dark.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned AI, which is on everyone's mind these days. And are there lessons from your case studies that could be applied to helping us think through the ongoing development of AI systems more wisely?
I sure hope so. So, if I just echo off what the idea of what it really took for the automotive age to come in, it took technology, like traffic lights. It took norms, like when we get to an intersection, we turn in a wide way so other cars can come. And it took regulation, like driver's licenses. So I'd argue by analogy, we might want to think about what are technologies that can control or limit, what are norms that ought to be followed related to ethics, and what are regulations that ought to be put in place to make sure some of the downsides that could come with AI, and you can think about a lot of them, we don't see too many of them. Now, I can't say that I'm particularly optimistic that we're going to see a lot of this in at least the short term, but I hope in the medium and longer term we see more of it, because otherwise I think it's going to get pretty ugly. And maybe we need that. Maybe we need a period of ugly before we get to the period of beauty. I don't know. There's a lot that I love about AI. I love playing with it. I use it in my classes. There's many, many beautiful things about it. But like everything, there's a shadow to it.
Right. Yeah. Are there points at which we start to realize that certain innovations are just not worth it? I mean, I think of, now the kind of backlash against social media, which I think rightly so has been growing, in part due to the work that Jonathan Haidt and others are doing about the disruptive, no, not disruptive, but
Dictionary
destructive.
style. See, there you go. This
Yeah,
is
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
this is why Clay hated the word at the end.
exactly.
But it is. I mean, it
Yeah,
is
yeah,
dictionary
yeah.
style, disruptive and destructive. Sorry to
Yeah,
talk over
yeah.
you.
No, so but then take a more extreme example is something like smoking, right? And where tobacco for centuries was a very popularly used, you could call it an innovation if it's it's widespread use that was solving a particular problem, adding value for people, helping them at least experience in their own subjective views a better quality of life. And now it's almost universally recognized as harmful, right? And so I wonder whether you see ways in which innovations at some point just we start to judge their overall benefit as really being not worth their costs.
You've named some examples, and I think there's others. McDonald's is a chapter in the book, and,
Right,
and
right.
McDonald's is not
Yeah,
without its critics. And
yeah,
I think
yeah.
people at McDonald's would be the first to admit, or one of McDonald's main products that it sells is Coca-Cola, and Coca-Cola's
Sure.
purpose is to refresh the world and make a difference. And there are a lot of people who say, and also push a lot of sugar and create a lot of things that are hard to recycle. And so I think there are lots of categories of things where genies get out of bottles and we say, what have we done? And again, in my view, and I'm not an expert in public policy, so admit your limitations, but in my view, this is the role of government to say that there is a tragedy of the commons that might come. There are market forces that, if they push too far, actually lead to consumer downsides. You have addictive things that really make our lives worse. I'm a huge fan of John Haidt and all of his work. And he says, to my point about AI, I'm channeling him. He says, we're about to do it again. We've seen this movie now. The idea that we're going to allow AI companies to create friend bots for kids is horrific, just an awful idea. So, I think for many of these categories, there's a really important role for governments and for regulators to check some of our worst instincts as humans or as business leaders.
Yeah, yeah. If let me ask you to extend your framework of disruptive innovation to another domain, which is religion and spirituality. Do you see ways in which religions that are trying to survive in a changing world, and particularly in the modern West, where you see simply a lot of decline in the importance of religion, what lessons could religious institutions or spiritual organizations, communities learn from this theory of disruptive innovation that might be helpful? Do you perhaps see any signs where maybe some of this is at work already?
One of my favorite things about doing interviews is when you're asked a question you've never been asked before. And this is a question I've never been asked before. And I love that. So I am not an expert in this space. So I will not be able to give you, here are 3 examples of what different religious organizations are doing. But if I go to the theory and go to the models, what would it tell me? It would say, well, this idea of non-consumption, you certainly have a growing population of people, if you just look at the statistics, who are not choosing to engage with religion. And I would always want to understand why. What is the barrier? Is it that it takes too much time? They perceive it as something that doesn't fit their lifestyle, et cetera. And can you then innovate in ways to make things simpler, more accessible? More affordable isn't quite the right metaphor, but that would be a thing you think about. And what I would then look for is, okay, what are people doing on, despite the downsides, what are people doing on platforms like TikTok and YouTube and so on to try and engage populations in different forms of ways? I would also want to look for different geographies and say, you've got religions that have very strong bases in particular geographies and almost no presence in other geographies. How do you think differently about playing in different geographies? I would think about that time-tested view that magic happens at intersections when you bring different mindsets and backgrounds together. What might happen if you intersect religion with other fields? Maybe the revival of independent bookstores, something that nobody saw coming. Is there something that we can learn from that about how you might revive religion in particular communities? So those would be at least some of the things that I would think about. This idea that there's always something to learn from different places, I think is a really powerful thing. One of the things I always will tell innovators, you're ever stuck on anything, get out of where you are. Go to a different place, go to a different industry, read a magazine in a different field, stop reading the nonfiction book you're reading and read a fiction book, stop reading the fiction book you're reading, read a nonfiction book. You've got a problem in your head, you'll see a connection when you go and look in those different places.
Great. No, thank you. Lastly, were there any big surprises and any, as you were doing the research on this book? I mean, there's certainly a lot of history here. Anything that perhaps changed your mind about some aspect of the theory or the model or added a complication or nuance that you weren't expecting?
Well, the thing that really struck me, the fourth question we've talked about a few times, is innovation a universal good? And look, I'm a believer. I'm a proselytizer. I go and spread the gospel of disruption. I really do think it makes the world a better place. The research has made me more humble that there is another side to it. The shadow that we talked about is a very real thing. And there are good reasons to have things that can buffer and catch some of that shadow. So I go in now, eyes wide open that yes, disruption remains a powerful force for democratization, development, and progress. And it comes at a cost.
Yeah. Well, let me leave you with the last word, perhaps, if there's anything else that you really want to drive home about your book, any other key points that we've not discussed yet that you'd really want to make sure that you share with our audience, what might they be?
Oh, we've covered a lot of great territory. I think the one thing that I would just emphasize, it is at its core an optimistic book. So, it is easy right now to not feel optimistic for lots of reasons. There's so much going on. Some of it is pretty ugly in some places. I am a believer that disruption drives progress. Disruption enables more people to solve more problems, to do new things, and live better lives. It's easy to feel fear, the status quo bias, the King's Proclamation from 1548.
Right.
We don't live it, but we still kind of feel it. My wish for is that people find the fun in it. I love playing. I love playing with new technologies. I love playing with new ideas. When you view something as fun, as opposed to something that's fearful, you just look at things a lot differently. So that's a message I hope they take from the book.
That's great. Well, Scott, thank you so much. It's been such a delight. Where can we drive our audience to learn more about your work?
So LinkedIn is the social media platform that I spend my time on. There's also a companion website for the book, epicdisruptions.com. Disruptions is plural. There are 11 of them in the book after all, epicdisruptions.com.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Scott. This has been great.
Brandon, thank you very much. I've enjoyed the conversation.
All right, folks, that's a wrap for this episode. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with someone who would find it of interest. Also, please subscribe and leave us a review if you haven't already. Thanks, and see you next time.